or some eyebrows. The priest got a part of it, and a lot of times if they couldn't eat it all, they would sell it to the market, to the meat markets. And then the worshiper would also get a main part of it. And a lot of times that would be the part that they would use at the banquet halls and stuff. So we looked at Acts 15:23 through 29. The conclusion that at the Jerusalem conference was, don't eat food sacrificed to idols or from the blood of the meat that was strangled. And then we talked about, we got into 1 Corinthians chapter 8. See where we're at. And the first 3 verses were knowledge and love. And we talked about what was more important. Well, Corinthians put a lot of emphasis on knowledge, but the most important was love. And they didn't really put a lot of emphasis on that. So they were puffed up. They thought they were arrogant. They said they could do this, eat idols, eat food that was sacrificed to idols in the banquet halls and stuff, and wouldn't bother their conscience. And we looked at some passages. And we looked at Matthew 22:39, which states what? Second commandment. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Okay. So then we looked at verses 4 through 6. How do Christians look at an idol? How does a non-Christian look at an idol? So the Christian looked at an idol as nothing. We only have one God. And but the weak brother, just coming out of pagan worship and stuff, they didn't have that knowledge yet. So they were actually, that bothered them when you did eat in front of them like that, in front of in the banquet halls and stuff. And then non-Christians looked at it as they were worshiping these idols. So when you ate at the banquet hall, what were you showing the non-Christians and the weak brother? Yeah. So that was basically the whole point here. Idols are nothing. Eating meat sacrificed to them should be a matter of indifference, except for the problem of violating the weaker brother's conscience. So then we talk about knowledge and its limitations. And we just mentioned that the weaker brother still had issues with the pagan deities, and that would defile a weaker brother. Then we talked about the stumbling block, and we spent a lot of time on that. And basically, we came to the conclusion that a stumbling block is you're causing your brother to actual sin. It's causing him to sin. That's the stumbling block that we're talking about here. And then verse 13, we're going to start here, and I want to read verse 13 and then get into chapter 9. Well, actually, there's a couple questions we want to ask first. So, therefore, if food makes a brother to stumble, this is 1 Corinthians 8:13. Therefore, if food makes a brother to stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brothers stumble. So, we want to remember that, because that's the whole thing that Paul's going to talk about in chapter 9, really, is that law. So, first question I'm going to ask you, if it's reckless and irresponsible to dine at an idol's temple, then can it be just as reckless and irresponsible to dine in a bar, nightclub, or cocktail party? What's y'all thoughts on that? Yeah, and maybe it's got the best food in West Tennessee at this bar you want to go to. But, your car's there. People know your car. Maybe you just go by yourself. But still, I think just the appearance of going to that bar, the appearance of, they know that's your car and you're in that bar, I think that could have a big influence on people.
I think an important point here, though, is it a bar or a restaurant? Like, can people look at you and say, oh, he's going in there to eat food? Because, you know, there's a lot of restaurants that serve alcohol and they got a bar.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's the issue. The idea is there a place where people are going to look at you and go, oh, look what he's going in there to do? You know?
Yeah.
Yeah, what's the primary purpose of the place?
Okay. So the other question I had, an idol is anything that you consider more important than serving God. So if we put our family, our possessions, our fame, our skill, our sports, our hobbies, our kids' hobbies, whatever, as a priority, can our example influence others? You guys are quiet today. What's y'all thoughts on that? Yeah, right? So, okay, so my next question, it's not on here, is we all have a conscience, right? Some consciences, some people are more conservative than others, I guess I should say. Can we possibly do everything to please everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, so where do we draw the line? Stumbling block.
Exactly. Yeah.
Stumbling block. You know. That's in love. You know, if I love my brother, I'm going to. You got out of this question. I'm going to pick on you tonight, later on, Michael. So basically, you know. Yeah. And I got some questions I asked at the end of chapter 10 that actually could be right here too. So you're going on a trip with a friend of yours, and they have a problem with Christian rock. So you put your Christian rock tape in there and play it the whole time you're there. Right? Is that really being a good thing to do? You have your love of your brother in your sight, doing something like that? No. I mean, so I think that's the issue. You know, we can't all agree on everything, but we need to realize that, hey, if we know this person and we know he has an issue with this, we don't lot it in front of them, do we? That's the main thing. Billy? Yeah. Okay. All right. There's a paragraph I want to read, and then we'll get in chapter 9. I just came across this as I was reading, and I thought it was a really interesting point here. So this is talking about chapter 8 and 9. At the heart of Paul's discussion on chapter 8 and 9 was an insistence by Corinthian brethren that they had the right to eat meat that had been sacrificed to an idol. Paul conceded that meat purchased at the marketplace had not been spiritually contaminated by being offered to an idol, and that's found in 10:25. However, the apostle firmly said that consuming meat to an idol's temple as part of the rite praising a false god was a sin. And that's also found in 10:21. No faith or knowledge could change such an act that what it appeared to be adultery. In addition, Paul pointed to the negative influence that a Christian might have on others by dining at the idol's temple. Even if the Christian could avoid adultery while eating at the temple of an idol, he might still encourage a weak Christian to sin. A strong Christian would be willing to forgo freedom for the sake of the weak. Christians today have very similar dilemmas. When should one give up the right for the sake of a weak brother's conscience? And when should he refuse to be bound by other traditions? The biblical answer is that it depends on the circumstance. The followers of Jesus ate with unclean hands in Matthew 15:22. They would not be forced into observing man-approved ceremonial washing just to avoid offending the Pharisees. It would be impossible to live by the conscience of everyone we encounter daily. However, in some cases, when we know the sincerity of a fellow Christian in the way he has interpreted the Bible, we should be willing to give up certain rights rather than exercising our rights and causing our brother to stumble. I think that sums it up. Any questions? Okay, let's go and get in chapter 9 then.
Mark, I had one point, and this doesn't deal with the discussion, but verse 11 I think is important for another reason. Because of your knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. So he's a brother, and he can perish. Once saved, always saved. That's not true.
No, it isn't.
And
No.
Christ died for him. So here Christ died for someone that could be lost. So there goes limited atonement too. So that's just, I think, a good verse.
Yeah, and we're going to actually look at that more in chapter 10. We're going to get more in that, involved in that in chapter 10. On one being lost can be lost. Okay, good point. So again, we need to look at 8:13 sets down the rule, which states again that if food makes my brother to stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So that's the rule that Paul set forth here. And to chapter 9, Paul's going to use that rule through his life. We're going to look at through Paul's life in ways that he actually applied that rule in his life. So let's look at the first 7 verses of chapter 9. Have anybody want to volunteer reading those? 1 through 7.
Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work of the Lord? If you others, I am not an apostle. Please, I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. I do this to those who examine me as this. Do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a daily life, even as the rest of the apostles and brothers in the Lord receive us? Or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working, who at the time served as a co-worker at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not eat the milk of the flock?
Okay. So Paul had some rights as an apostle. In verse 22, he kind of goes into 2 points to show that he was an apostle. And the first one is, it's supposed to be Acts 9:5, not 15. He had seen the resurrection of the Lord. In Acts 9:5, he was on the road to Damascus, and who appeared to him? Okay, and that was after he was raised from the dead and went to heaven. So that was he was he did see the Lord, the resurrected Lord. And then the Corinthians were his seal. It states here. So how were they his seal? Okay, so in other words, he converted he started a Corinthian church and stuff. How else would they be his seal? What did Paul give the Corinthians? Yeah, he gave them the spiritual gifts. What did they see Paul do? Said it. Miracles, right? So yeah, they were his seal because they knew he was an apostle, because he converted them, he gave them the spiritual gifts, and they saw his miracles. Okay. So
If Paul's not an apostle, then they're not, if he's not a legitimate apostle, then he could say, well, then are you not legitimate Christians, or what,
yeah, how'd you get your
that
gifts?
just is absurd,
All these miracles you saw me do. How did I fool you on these things or whatever? Yeah, and 2 Corinthians, he has to go in and do his prove his apostleship. So there were several there that tried to get the Corinthians to believe that he was not an apostle. So what are some rights and liberties that Paul didn't partake of, that the Word of God might, so that the Word of God might have great success? What's the first one? You have the right to eat and drink. What does he think he's talking about here by eat and drink? I mean, we all have to eat and drink, right? Yeah, or I thought too that could be that he had the right to eat and drink. This church help him with eating and drinking, or even the Christian brethren there could help him with his food and drink. So he had that right. He had the right to marry, right? And who did he use as this? I thought this was interesting. That was married. Yeah, Peter. Peter was married. And it sounds like Peter took his wife a lot of times with him on things. I kind of got that impression when I read that for some reason. I don't know why I did that, but anyway. So, yeah.
and the brothers of the Lord, and the other apostles. So we mentioned Cephas in particular, but brothers of the Lord.
Yeah. And we already went into that part of his chapter 7, why he didn't get married. To help with the Word of God, and so he could devote more time serving Christ. Chapter 9. Yeah. Yes. Okay. And then he had the right to receive pay, but we're going to see that also later in the chapter, why he didn't receive pay from them. So what three illustrations did Paul use to show the demonstration that the laborer was justified to receive wages in verse 7?
Warrior, military man.
Yeah.
You don't go to war at your own expense. Vineyard keeper and the flock shepherd.
Yeah, and the vineyard keeper, you expect to taste the fruits of your vineyard, right? To take of those fruits. And those that care for the flock, they would eat the milk and make the butter and cheese from the the flock. So they would benefit from the flock that they were taking care of. Any more questions on those first 7 verses? So I guess the main point here is a laborer is worthy of his hire. Okay. All right, let's read 8 through 14. Anybody want to volunteer for that? Michael, you're volunteering.
I am not speaking these things according to human judgment, for does the law also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, "You shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing." God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it is written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. If we sow spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we endured all things, so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel.
Okay, so verse 8 and 9, what was Paul's point about not muzzling the ox while he was threshing? Yeah, and if he was muzzled, he couldn't eat that, could he? So Deuteronomy 25:4 is where this was taken. And oxen were used to tread out the grain on the threshing floor. The animal was attached to poles on a large millstone. And as he walked around the millstone, its hooves would trample the grain and separate the kernels and the chaff. And at the same time, the millstone would grind the grain into flour. So to muzzle the ox would prevent it from eating while it was working, just as a preacher shouldn't be denied his benefits. And I had a couple scriptures there. Let's just turn to 1 Timothy 5 real quick and read that, verse 17 and 18. Whoever gets it, go ahead and read it. 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18.
Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages."
Okay, so it basically states there that, again, that those that labor in the word are worthy of getting paid. Just as an animal, okay, that's the 2 points we just made by the threshing the ox. So why did Paul concede on this right to receive wages from the Corinthians? Yes. 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 And so I had a couple points here that may upset the faith of some of the brethren. Some thought that he would have been too much money to give him. Possibly would make him very similar to those philosophers who expected pay. That was probably one of his main points there.
With all that being said, later on, though, they gripe about him not taking their
Yes.
money. And they're like, what, our money ain't good enough for you? So it just goes to show you.
Can't win.
You can't win,
Yeah.
You ain't complete everybody,
Yeah. Yeah. So Those are very good points. Okay. So what similarities did the Old Testament priests of Israel have with the New Testament ministers of the gospel? Verses 13 and 14. Yes, yes. It's the same with the priests, right? They got they got part of that sacrifice. Okay. So let's read 15 through 18. We might get through 9. Going pretty good. Okay.
Verse 15. But I have used none of these things, and I am not writing these things that it may be done so in my case. For it would be better for me to die than to have any man make my boast in emptiness. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. What then is my reward? That when I approach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my right of the gospel.
Okay. So he's talking about being a good steward. What reassurance did Paul give them concerning getting wages from them? Verse 15.
I'm not saying you should pay me.
Yeah. Over my dead body, I'm not going to get paid. I don't want your pay.
Yeah.
I don't care what you do. I'm not going to take your pay. Pretty much is what he's telling them. So what did Paul mean by he had nothing to boast in? This is kind of interesting here. But he did boast, actually. His reward was
He's only boasting within the gospel and in Jesus Christ.
right,
Not in himself.
right.
Not at all in himself. Now, while we're there, on verse 16, I have a reference to Jeremiah 20 and verse 9. Jeremiah 20 and verse 9, he kind of said it the same way. But if I say, I will not remember him or speak any more in his name, then in my heart it becomes like a burning fire, shut up in my bones, and I am weary of holding it in, and I cannot endure it. I mean, Jeremiah, if he tried not to speak, he'd explode.
Yes, and that's the same with Paul, right? He had that desire to speak to people.
There's something else too that when he says necessity is laid upon me, I think he literally means that he has to.
Yeah.
He'll go to hell because Jesus called him to do this. And I think Paul's a special case in that. I've often heard these verses used. It's sort of about preachers in general. That if you have the talent to preach, then you very much have to preach or you're wrong. And I don't think that's true. I think in Paul's special case, he actually had necessity laid on him because of his unique situation. He had seen the Lord, and the Lord called him specifically. You know, people say the Lord called me today, but I guarantee you they didn't get called like Paul got called.
No.
And he had to. So he's saying, look, I can't boast in preaching. I can't because I have to do this. I can't boast in it. So the only thing that I can boast in is me preaching free of charge.
Yeah.
I think his persecution that he had done previous in his life had a lot to do with what you were saying as well.
Yeah, and that's basically my notes here were that preaching wasn't an option for Paul. The mission that Christ had given him compelled him to preach. It was his compulsion. And Paul not accepting money from them was the icing on the cake. That's what I kind of had down there for that.
People were always challenging him to anyway.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like you're already hitting me over here. Do I want this double whammy here? He's just out for the money and do we really know whether he didn't see him walking with Jesus, right?
Yeah, and this is Paul's word here that he's saying, hey, I saw Jesus on the road to Damascus. None of the Corinthians were there there to when he did that. So, but again, he also used them as a seal, by his miracles, by his giving them all these gifts, and then actually converting them, starting the church in Corinth.
If you think you want to be a preacher, I would recommend reading Jeremiah, because at somewhere or the other, you're going to be treated the same way that he was. I mean, people in the church can be some of the meanest and cruelest people.
Yeah, and I got a couple of questions that we're going to talk about that a little bit. Not a whole lot, but we're going to get into that a little bit. Kind of how we look at a preacher versus how we should treat the preacher. So we can see here that what was Paul's reward, or what could he boast in? His motives were pure. He gained the respect. He did this voluntarily, and it showed his love for Christ. That was the main reason why he boasted in this. So the main point to take away from this is Christians may choose to ignore a right or liberty for the sake of a greater good. Paul's example illustrates this point. Paul's plea was for Christians not to take such pride in their knowledge, but to forgo those rights to show concern for their brethren. Okay, this goes all the way back to chapter 8. Same thought. Any more questions on that section? All right, let's read 19 through 23. Who wants to volunteer for that? Yeah, 19 through 23.
Although I am free from all men, I made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so that I may win Jews. To those who are under the law, I was under the law, so not esteem myself under the law, so that I may win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, so I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means have some, or by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it.
Okay. So Paul became a slave to all at this point. So his main point here is Paul put his ministry of the gospel above his personal desires. He is willing to conform to the customs of other people in order to bring them to Christ. So, can we think of some examples in Paul's life where he did this? Anybody?
Somewhere while I was reading the other day, I can't remember where it was, in Acts somewhere, where he took Timothy and he circumcised him.
Yes. Acts 16:3. I had that down there.
Okay.
So let's turn to Acts 16:3. Did Timothy have to be circumcised here? Well, let's just read it. Acts 16:3. I got that. I'll read that real quick. It was both, it's talking about Timothy here. This is start at 1. Then he came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. He was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted to have him go on with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in the region. So that was one reason he circumcised Timothy, because he wanted to reach these Jews, and that was he thought that Timothy would have a better chance working with him and helping him if he was circumcised. Yeah.
I asked Austin Lewis about this one time, and he gave a very
Yes. And Paul did these things, but he did not, like, what am I thinking of here? I had an example here. I don't know where I wrote it down at. But anyway, Paul would do the things of the law to help convert the Jews, but he would not actually be bound by the law. Does that make sense?
And Paul, usually when he went to a town, one of the first places he went to was a Jewish synagogue and tried to reach those people. And he knew if Timothy's going to be along with him, they needed to take care of this business ahead of time.
Yep. Okay. I had a couple things here. Acts 21:23, he made a Nazarite vow in the temple to relate to the Jews in Jerusalem, circumcised Timothy. In Galatians 5:1, the Gentile Christians wanted to be circumcised, adopt the Jewish ways, but Paul told them, no, man, you don't need to. We're not going there. You don't need to be bound by the law of Moses. And they ate their food and observed their customs to gain their confidence. And then finally, as a Gentile, Paul avoided the ceremonial aspects of Jewish customs when he was talking to the Gentiles and trying to convert them.
Yeah, there's that interesting little phrase there. To those who are without law, as without law. But then he goes in brackets. Not being without law towards God,
Yeah,
but under law towards Christ. So he's saying it's like not that I just throw law out the window in general. It's like, but I'm not gonna be a Jew, really Jewish in front of Gentiles.
Gentiles. Yeah. Would that work really good in trying to convert Gentiles if you have all these Jewish customs and stuff? No. So how can we apply this today when we are trying to teach the gospel to people? I think we kind of covered it some already.
I'm trying to think of, we live in America, and even though we have a very atheistic culture, there's still, in this part of the world, a lot of Christian customs, you might say. But I'm thinking, like, what if you were trying to convert, like, Islam, Muslim,
Yeah.
or something, there's a lot of customs that they have that we're not familiar with. Like maybe taking off I think they take off their shoes or something when they go in the house. Maybe something like that. There's this, and maybe there's certain clothing and stuff, and so you might cater to some of that, as long as it wouldn't be wrong. As long as you understand that you're not going against the one true God to worship their version of God. But just kind of thinking maybe would be like a similar situation.
Yeah, I had a couple things here. It's kind of different than what probably most of your thoughts will. I don't have them not down here. Let's see here. Might be some liberties we have to give up while we are teaching them. Maybe they have different views on certain things that we think it's not important, but we may want to give those liberties up while we're teaching them. And it may not be the right time to bring up certain habits that they have. If they're really worldly people, and we're teaching them about Christ and being a good example, and Christ is our example, maybe the way they dress or their speech may be not totally Christian-like, but we don't want to me, I don't think we want to overwhelm them with a billion things that they have to change, So that's kind of what I thought, maybe some things that we might need to conform to help preach the gospel and teach it. Yeah, I mean, we want to put. Yes.
you let them go, and then all of a sudden you say, well, you really need to try, change. Well, but bless this nothing anyway, and he'll say you're lovely.
Yeah.
It's hard to try to slowly, what you're really saying is, I want you to figure out that you're dressing wrong and change.
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, a person coming out of the world and being a Christian, they got a ton of things they got to learn. And do you want to bombard them with that all at once? Right.
I think what you're trying to say is when you're teaching somebody, right, on a one-on-one basis, you don't want to hammer every single aspect of their life. Start with Jesus ate with who? Prostitutes, sinners.
Right.
I mean, everything. So start with preaching the gospel first, and as you begin to preach and teach the gospel to them, and they believe in Jesus Christ, then they begin to then stop drinking the milk of the word, and going into more meat, those things as they begin to study and have more conversation and are around more Christians, right, begin to see, okay, how potentially a Christian is conducting themselves.
Yeah.
Marty, I think it's about principles. There are just certain things that people are not ready for yet.
Yes.
And so you want to be laying down principles to get them there. You know, so maybe that process it looks like, for me, it's always been, I need to lay down certain principles first with people, but I do need to get to that. But they need to understand certain principles first before we get there. And if they do come back and say, well, why didn't you go there to begin with? It's like, well, you weren't ready. We've been laying the groundwork
Yeah.
for this. So that to me is the way that I've been.
I think a lot of times too, not to take anything offensive, but traveling to other countries,
Oh, yeah.
especially for business, there's things that are very, very customary in other cultures that are not us, that unknowingly I've done before, that is very offensive, right? Simple things like flipping a fish at dinner, right? Or maybe having a cup higher than someone else. You don't know it, but over time you begin to learn those things, what they mean to someone else, right? And again, until you have that groundwork of understanding, I think you understand.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah, if I'm trying to convert somebody that's Chinese, I may have to figure out their customs and not offend them when I'm teaching them. Elizabeth?
I think it also has a matter of just what we join in with in school. So for instance, as we talked about, like immodesty or something of the nature that we've seen for a long time, you know, we wouldn't join them in the immodesty because they would come
Right.
to us in that. They would see over the course of the time, you never dress like me in this.
Yes.
Then why? And then, well, the scriptures tell me this.
Yes.
That the Lord wants me to treat my body.
Yeah, I am not saying that actually, you know, get into the really habits of them, but to kind of have their understanding and their background in mind when you're teaching them. Okay, so we're going to finish up 9 and get into 10. And 10's a long chapter, so I don't know if we'll get through it or not, but anyway. Thanks for your comments.